What's up? Today we're going to discuss some fascinating opening traps in one of the most historically rich chess openings, the Ponziani Opening. This opening arises from one of the most common first moves in chess: pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now you play pawn to c3. I'm pretty sure your opponents aren't aware of all the traps I'm about to share with you today. Now, after pawn to c3, we're going to play pawn to d4, building a strong pawn center. Black will have to respond to this, and a common move is knight to fe6, continuing their development. Then you play pawn to d4 again, reinforcing the center. We'll discuss Black's main response in a moment, but first, let me show you what often happens when your opponent is unprepared for this particular opening system. When that happens, they tend to avoid tactical complications like capturing a pawn, because white will usually recapture, leading to messy positions. That's why sometimes your opponents will play a simple and solid move, pawn to d6. Some players prefer to avoid unfamiliar opening theory, opting instead to complete their development while staying safe. In this case, you can push pawn to d5, attacking the knight, which must retreat. Now you can play a tricky move, bishop to g5. At first glance, it looks like a simple developing move, possibly aiming to pin a piece along the diagonal. However, at this point, Black is very likely to believe that you have blundered the central pawn on e4. Most opponents will eagerly capture it, thinking they are winning a free pawn while also attacking your bishop. It appears as though Black is taking full control of the position, but in reality, this is a trap. You can now play queen to a4, delivering a double attack on the king and the knight. As a result, Black is in serious trouble and in many cases may have no choice but to resign immediately. The great thing about this trap is that you set it up naturally as part of your development. Even if Black doesn't fall for it, you can simply continue playing and you'll still have a strong position. This move gives white exactly what they want: a strong center and an additional tempo. However, it's hard to explain why so many players still choose to play bishop to c5. Because this mistake is so common, you could almost call it a trap in itself. Now, let me show you how to punish Black for playing bishop to c5. Once again, when your opponent makes this rather questionable move, white should respond with pawn to d4, gaining central control while attacking the bishop. This position resembles the Italian game, but with an extra tempo for white. And since the Italian game is already a strong opening for white, having an extra tempo makes it even better. Playing this position with an extra tempo is simply winning for white. So here, white is already in a winning position. Now, let's return to the Ponziani opening and see what happens next. At this point, your pawn is attacking Black's bishop and pawn, so they will likely trade. You then recapture, renewing the threat to the bishop. In response, Black will typically play bishop to b4, pinning the knight. Now you continue with knight to c3. At this point, Black will make a move. It doesn't matter too much, but let's say they play knight to f6, though knight to c6 is actually the most played move. Here you have another strong option, pawn to d5, immediately seizing control of the center and challenging Black's position. Now you take advantage of the fact that your knight is controlling the key square, preventing Black's knight from advancing. Since the knight is also under attack by your pawn, it must retreat, either to bishop 8 or a 7, both of which are very passive squares. Meanwhile, white gains even more space, further strengthening the central pawn structure. You already have a dominant position, with strong pawns in the center, open lines for your pieces, and excellent control over the board. Now, white continues development by playing bishop to d3. Here's something interesting. The most played move by Black in this position is pawn to d6, which we'll analyze next. It's easy to understand why Black plays pawn to d6 in this position. Without this move, white might consider playing pawn to a5 in the near future, attacking the knight and gaining even more space. Black anticipates this threat and plays pawn to d6 to prevent it while also opening the diagonal for their light-squared bishop. While this move seems reasonable, there is one major problem. Black loses immediately after queen to a forecheck. This move delivers a check to the king, while simultaneously attacking the bishop on b4. As a result, white simply captures the bishop for free. The best part about this trap is that it's incredibly common, meaning your opponents are very likely to fall for it. But even if they don't, white still has a strategically winning position, with strong central control and excellent piece activity. Anyway, thanks to our strong center and complete domination, we have a great position. Now let's move on to the main line. The most common response from Black is knight to f6. After white pushes in the center with pawn to e4, Black captures white's central pawn on e4 with their knight. Now, even though white could potentially recapture the pawn in the center, it's actually stronger to push the pawn forward and use this opportunity to drive the knight back. After the knight retreats, you can recapture the pawn on e5. Here's something interesting. In most games, black plays a well-known mistake, pawn to d6. This move is fairly common, yet many players are unaware of its flaws, as it is the most played move by black in this position. This move loses for black, and funnily enough, for a couple of reasons. First, as we discussed earlier in the traps, white could play queen to a4, delivering a check. This just shows how often black misses this standard tactical idea. If white plays queen to a4, it would win immediately. However, in this position, there is an even stronger alternative. Instead of queen to a4, white can deliver the same check with bishop to b5. After bishop to b5 check, black suddenly has a difficult time defending their king. In similar positions, black would usually try to cover the king with bishop to d7, but in this case, that doesn't work because white attacks the square twice. As a result, after bishop takes d7, the bishop is now defended, and black is forced to give up their queen for the bishop just to avoid the check. Since bishop to d7 fails for black, they might try pawn to c6 as an alternative defensive move. However, this does not solve their problems either. White can immediately capture on c6, creating threats of discovered checks. At this point, white has multiple options, including pushing pawn to c7, forcing black's king into an awkward position while the bishop delivers a powerful check. Black is then compelled to recapture the pawn on c6, but this only worsens their situation. White follows up with knight takes c6, launching an aggressive attack that targets multiple pieces at once. Black's position begins to crumble, as the knight, the queen, and the king are all under immediate pressure. In response, black often plays queen to b6, attempting to add some defensive resources to their position. However, this move does little to improve their standing. If black tries to recapture material here, they fall into a devastating triple attack, where white simultaneously threatens the king, rook, and knight. With no viable escape, black is left in an almost hopeless position, and white is well on their way to a decisive victory. That's why black cannot recapture. In most games, black responds with queen to b6, trying to complicate the situation, but this move doesn't work. The best course of action for white is to move the knight back, which is the simplest way to continue the attack. This move renews the check on black's king, forcing it to move. As a result of this tactical maneuver, white is now a piece up, and black's king is in a precarious position. Without the ability to castle, black is forced to leave the king exposed in the center, making it vulnerable to further attacks. Moreover, black's knight on e4 becomes weak, and overall, their position begins to collapse. From here, white can continue pressing the attack, targeting black's vulnerable king. With a central weakness and black's scattered pieces, white is in a dominant position and will likely win the game with ease. I hope you understand all variation. If you found this video helpful, then like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.